Communications Librarian at Stellenbosch University. Today's session is under the theme of Let's Kickstart the Research Process. Our main speaker is Prof. Susan van Skyk. Prof. Susan is a professor in health profession education and director of the Center for Health Professions Education in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Science at Stellenbosch University. Apart from her involvement in postgraduate studies, two main strands of work relate to doctoral education, specifically doctoral writing and curriculum renewal informed by transformative learning theory. Prof. Susan is a B2 rated researcher with the National Research Foundation and a fellow of International Associations of Medical Educationalists. She serves on the editorial boards of several health professions, education journals, and has authored or co-authored more than 90 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Today, I wish to welcome everyone to our Research or Library Research Week 2024 under the theme of Let's Achieve Research Excellency. The session is going to be conducted in a way that if anyone has a question, is more than welcome to put it on the or write it on the chat box. Then if it's the burning questions or anything that we want to comment on, we will be granting the opportunity for questions and a question and answers. Other than that, allow me to welcome all of you to our Library Research Week 2024. Over to you, Prof. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Yes, here we are. It's Tuesday. I think it's the second day of the Library Week, and I don't know how many of those of you who are online are hoping to attend a couple of sessions across the week. But it seems to me as if the library has put together a really exciting program. And if you sort of follow the program step by step, it does appear that you'll be up and running in terms of your research by the time we get to Friday. So yeah, I'm going to just share my slides and let's see if we can get all of this going in a way that is useful. And let's just get into slideshow mode. Right, and if someone could just confirm that they can see the screen and hear me clearly, then that would be great. Okay,
Yes,
I
Prof.
can already see some hands up. And I'm now not able to see the chat. So if we will leave lots of time right at the end for questions. So don't worry about that. I'll be watching my time carefully. But having said that, if anyone has a burning question at any point during the presentation, please feel free to shout it out, because I'm quite sure that if it's a burning question for you, then it's probably a burning question for others. But perhaps my colleagues from the library can also assist and alert me if there are a number of questions building up. I will stop a couple of times through the presentation just to give formal opportunity for sort of in between questions as well. But as we heard at the start, you're welcome to put questions in the chat, which we will attend to at the end. So I hope that sort of works for everyone. Okay, so we're going to spend a bit of time looking at the research proposal. And I've brought into the title two ideas, that of principles and that of process. And I'm hoping that across the next sort of 40 minutes, because I think we've got an hour and 15 minutes, so we want to leave enough time for questions. I want us to first to explore some of the principles that sit beneath this thing called the research proposal, and indeed in some faculties referred to as the research protocol. What are the principles that sit beneath it, but then also to look at aspects of process. In other words, how does it get done? And before we even started, I asked you to start putting some ideas into the chat, questions, concerns that you have, and most of those were speaking to process issues. How much should we put into the literature review? How long should these different sections be? How much detail do we need in the methodology, and so on and so forth. So we will definitely attend to those. But it is important to first spend a little bit of time thinking about issues of the principles or the reason why we have a research proposal. So we'll move straight on and really talk a little bit about some of the definitional matters and what these terms say about your research. And so immediately, I'd like us to, I'm going to actually stop sharing because I'd actually like you to type into the chat for me. Why do you believe we have a research proposal? Let's hear from some of you before I share my ideas about why we have a research proposal. So let's hear. I'm watching the chat and I'm hoping some of you will share your thoughts and concepts. I've got lots of names in front of me, so I could start calling out some names. Why do we have a research proposal? Why do you think you do? I see Zola's put a hand up. So yes, Zola, go ahead, but others can type in the chat. Okay, Liesel de Waard is saying to ensure ethical research. Nice to see you're on board, Liesel. Thank you, and absolutely. The roadmap to set the process, says Mr. or Miss Johnson, to set the process to follow, to guide, so some good words there, guiding, giving us a roadmap. To determine if the research is worth conducting. Yes, I think that's a really important one. Zola, you're welcome to go ahead. I see your hand is up.
You are also welcome to unmute yourself if you want to suggest something over the microphone.
Okay, and lots of wonderful ideas coming in through in the chat to introduce the study, to align your work. Such a good idea, Marika. Thanks for that. Provide a plan and guide. Guides the focus of the study. Make sure it's viable. Yes, yes. To present the order to be to see if the research is viable. Oh, I see you were just correcting your typo there. To know that there's a place for your chosen study. I really like that. Estia, lovely idea that there's a place for your chosen study, that your study warrants and merits actually getting involved. Archie is suggesting the research proposal will help clarify the research question and provide an outline. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for those ideas, guys. And I'm going to be sort of popping in and out. Oh, I see, Zola, you've given it to us there to focus the topic of your research, highlights why your research is unique. And hi, Lamise, nice to see you. Colleagues, excuse me if I say hi to those I know, but it's always good to know that there are some well-known faces in the crowd. I see Yusuf is also with us today. To present and justify the need to study a research program. Okay, yeah, you guys don't need me here. Very much on board with why we need the proposal. I think the big thing here is, what do these terms say about your research? And you will see there that I've added the word protocol as well, because of course, depending on which environment you come from, depending on which discipline you come from, depending on which field you are in, you might use these terms differently. And so I wanted to start off today by emphasizing that I am a social scientist, I'm an educationalist. So while I have gone to a fair bit of trouble, as I always try to do, to cover examples from a wide range of fields, at the end of the day, each of you on the call, I mean, there are 100 people on this call, each of you will need to take away from what I say today, and in fact from what you hear from others, you have to take away what's relevant to your context. So I'm saying that right at the start as a bit of a disclaimer, because the words that we use and the way in which we do things tell others a little bit about who we are. And it's exactly the same with the research. When we approach our research, we immediately become part of a particular community, a particular disciplinary community who have a very specific way of doing. And while there are certain key principles, and those are the key principles we're going to be looking at today, there will be nuances, there will be differences that are relevant and specific to your environment, to your subject area, to your disciplinary field. And you will need to speak to your supervisor about those. So please don't go back and say, this is how I'm doing my proposal because Susan said this is the way to go. This is a generic overview of how to write a sound research proposal. Okay, so we've spent a bit of time talking about the purpose of the proposal and why it is necessary. I had a couple of things here that I think summarize most of what was mentioned in the chat. First of all, it's about keeping you on track. And many people mentioned that, the blueprint, the guideline, the direction, all of those things. But it's about keeping you on track in 4 very specific ways. It's about keeping you ethical, and that's probably the most important one for most of us, depending on your research, of course. But generally speaking, you will need to obtain ethics for any research that you do here at Stellenbosch University, unless you are doing a secondary evidence synthesis. In other words, if you're doing an analysis of something that already exists in the public domain, then you wouldn't need ethical clearance. But for every other type of study, you need ethical clearance from one of the research ethics committees. And you need to keep in mind when you're preparing your proposal that you are preparing it for a number of different audiences. Obviously, you're preparing it in a sense for yourself and for your research team if you're working with a team, and for your research supervisors if you're doing postgraduate studies. And I saw on the list of participants that Alvina sent through to me yesterday that many, many of you are busy with postgraduate studies. So obviously your proposal needs to speak to or be written in such a way that your supervisor audience can also understand what you're on about. But as you can see right on the top there, a key audience is, of course, the research ethics committees. And very often, the people within those committees who will be looking at your research proposal will be, could be people who are only aligned to your field. In other words, their knowledge and background and context may not be 100% the same as your knowledge and background, disciplinary background. And so you need to make sure that you explain your things sufficiently well, and we'll pick up on that as we go along. Then the second aspect of keeping you on track is obviously for your own planning, and often referred to as a blueprint, and many of you spoke about that in the chat. It's your guideline. As you can see on the third bullet there, others refer to the recipe, and that is particularly when it comes to implementation. So there are all these phases. It's first to assist the planning, because as you write your proposal, so the plan, the research design itself evolves. We all know that we get these brilliant ideas of, I want to do X. This seems to be an important research question to explore or study, but it's only when we actually get to writing these things down that we realize maybe this doesn't all hang together as it ought to. So it's the blueprint on the one hand for the planning process, and then the recipe on the other hand for the implementation. And then and this is again something that some of you mentioned right at the start when I asked about some of your concerns and uncertainty. Someone wrote about the scope of the literature review, for example. That is exactly what a well-written research proposal will keep you on track in terms of the scope of your study and the feasibility of that study. Okay. So carrying on with the theme of principles, let's go to those principles. And these are what I would call some of the most fundamental principles of preparing a research proposal. Firstly, accuracy. Now, you may be wondering why I put that one first. But as someone who has submitted many, many research proposals for research ethics approval, not only my own, but also then with my students, both PhD and master's students, accuracy is key. And accuracy is not just about getting it right in the moment, but it's also ensuring that you have accuracy across the entire proposal. So the more accurate your proposal is in terms of correctness, the more likely it is to get ethics approval, firstly, with ease, but secondly, to provide you with a useful guideline. We all know that a map that is not well calibrated, that is not accurately calibrated, is not going to be very helpful in getting us where we want to go. Okay, so another fundamental principle of the proposal is that it is practical. And this is sometimes quite difficult for people who are, for example, moving into doctoral studies after having completed masters, and they wanting to move straight to being extremely academic in their writing. Don't lose the practical element. Remember that the proposal is to provide you with your blueprint and your recipe, and therefore it needs to be practical. If it's a cup of flour that is needed, then you need to be very clear. And again, you can hear the accuracy actually coming through there as well, that it's about a cup of flour, and not some vague reference to different ingredients, if you get my sense. But then it's also important that an ethics proposal or a research proposal is clear and coherent. And many of you mentioned that. You actually asked the question right at the start. Someone said, how do I get my research proposal clear and coherent? So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get to the section specifically on the literature review. But right now, if we look just holistically at the proposal, it needs to be clear and coherent across the entire document, and that is usually achieved through your language. The way in which you use your language picks up again on what I've just been saying about beware of including too much jargon, of trying to sound so academic and so scholarly that you lose the clarity in your writing and you lose the coherence of your writing. And I mean, there, just as an aside, a good rule of thumb, keep your sentences short. A lot of work that I do in my faculty relates to academic writing, and that is one of the most important fundamental principles. Keep it short, keep it simple, keep it clear, keep it coherent, keep it practical, and be accurate in your writing. And keep in mind that your proposal obviously needs to be written in the future tense because you are proposing something. This is what you are suggesting. Now, that can get quite tricky in the literature review when you're obviously writing about something that has taken place. So when you write your literature review, the normal conventions around writing up the literature stand. So we typically write the literature review in the present tense. Author so-and-so argues X, Y, and Z. But the rest of your proposal, the rationale, when you're writing your rationale, and especially in your methods, methodology, methods and materials, whatever title you use, there you would typically write in the future tense. And then, as I was mentioning on the previous slide, remember it's not just for you. You are using this document to communicate your project with other stakeholders, to give them a full sense of what you are planning to do. The bottom line is, fundamental principle is that the proposal represents commitment. And here I often say to, for example, to my master's and my PhD students, when their proposals are completed, when they press the send button and send it off to Infonetica, which I'm sure all of you know is the program, the web-based program that is used for ethics applications here at Stellenbosch University. But when that is done, then you are committed in terms of your research. And you see it, especially with PhD students, they will talk about the PhD or a PhD. But once the proposal has been completed, then it starts becoming my PhD. And then just in closing, as far as the fundamental principles are concerned, is the clarity, colleagues, is in the writing. And so really, 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 even at this early phase of your research, it's about practicing writing. It's about being aware of keeping the way in which I communicate with others through the word in a very clear and concise manner. And I'm going to stop there for a moment. I'm going to stop sharing and let me have a look in the chat. And let's see if anyone has any questions as I pick up on some of the last suggestions that came through. Lemie saying it highlights why your research is unique. We're going to be getting to that when we talk about the rationale. You're absolutely right, Lemie. And Bali was saying to present and justify the need to study a research problem. So yes, to justification, again, we're going to be coming to that, and the way in which the study will be conducted. I see a hand, Sandile. Yes, if you'd like to go ahead. Would be great if you could put on your camera if you pose a question.
Good morning. Just one question. Sorry, I am in a bit of a mess in where I am now. Just one question. I didn't get quite clearly at the end when you spoke about literature review and the past and the present tense. Were you saying that with reference to literature review, we can perhaps implement the present tense? Or how yeah, I just didn't get that one clear.
Okay, so Sandile, we're going to be talking about the literature review shortly. So will you hold your question and hopefully we'll cover it then. Okay, yes, anything else? Okay, Sandile is saying thanks. Yes, I saw another hand.
Yes, Prof. I think we actually missed the one that was from Kirna and Sibongiseni. I'm not sure if I should read it now or we pack it as well. It was before we get the thingy, the research proposals ideas.
Okay, you mean some of the early questions?
Yes, Prof. Yes.
Okay, I've made a note of all of them, and I'm hoping that we will chat about them as we go through. Is that all right?
Yes, Prof. No problem. Thank you.
Fabulous. Okay, right. So let's get going again to start looking at the details, because I suspect that that is what most of you are interested in. Let me see if I can get this to work this way. Resume slideshow, that's better, right. Okay, so this is a horrible, horrible busy slide that you can see in front of you right now. But I've really tried to put everything onto one slide deliberately. And I need to emphasize, as I said right at the start, that this is just a conventional structure. This is a structure, not the structure. You might say, oh, no, 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 in our faculty, we don't do it like that. Or in our department, we have the order slightly differently. But typically, this is a pretty conventional structure. I'm going to show you another structure on the next slide, just to emphasize that there are different approaches and different ways of doing. But pretty much, we obviously have a title page. There's usually some sort of background, and we're going to go through each of these shortly. So hold your horses, but please make a note if there's anything that you think is missing from your typical understanding of the structure of a proposal. But we would have a short introduction and background. In some cases, immediately going on to a problem statement or a rationale for the study. In other cases, the rationale might come after the literature review. It really depends on how you develop your argument. You will see there that I've listed the conceptual framework, because in some fields that's really important. In other fields that might be subsumed at the end of the literature review. It doesn't necessarily have to be a section on its own. And then we have the methods section. If you're working in the humanities, if you're working in a qualitative space, you will talk about a methodology. But typically, you will have a research question or a hypothesis or something along those lines. Your aims and objectives. In some environments, they'll talk about an overarching aim and you won't see objectives. You need to describe the research design, and then usually things like sampling, data collection, data analysis would all fall within the research design. You really need a data management plan. That has become incredibly important of late, and especially with all the regulations we have, like the POPI Act and similar. You need to have some sort of comment about the quality of your data, demonstrate that you're aware of how different aspects of your study might influence the quality of your data. So you need to show that you're thinking critically about your study. Very important, especially if you're working in a qualitative space, that you demonstrate some sort of reflexivity or your positionality as a researcher, but then also allocate time to ethical considerations, space to ethical considerations, limitations of the study, but also how the study can contribute. Sometimes those will be separate sections. Some environments will talk about the significance of the study. Some environments require that you explain how you plan to disseminate your findings. And then important for the ethics submission as well is, of course, the budget, timelines, a complete and accurate reference list. And then there's a whole range of appendices, depending on the nature of your study. You're all aware of an informed consent form. If your research is making use of human subjects, that sounded terrible. If you'll be engaging with fellow human beings, but there might also be specific recruitment materials. You're going to put up posters and advertise examples of what how you're going to conduct your interviews and so on and so forth. And then I've just added here at the bottom, because it's also important to remember that for submitting to ethics committees, you need to also have a synopsis. So now I've talked a whole lot about a whole lot of different things. This one is quite small, but I hope you can see it. I use this with permission from Dr. Tanya Brodovsky, who heads up the Research Development Office in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. You can see a lot of very similar things, slightly different order here, starting off with definitions. Again, that may or may not be a convention in your environment. The intro, the literature review, and then the problem statement and the rationale, so different to the one on the previous page. Research question or hypothesis. See the methodology. Here you're seeing the requirement of inclusion and exclusion criteria. If you're going to be doing a qualitative study, sample size calculation, focusing on a recruitment strategy, and so on and so forth. There's a little bit more examples there around the data management plan, especially in the Faculty of Medicine. I suspect it would be true in the Faculty of Science as well, storage of specimens, and so on and so forth. So you can see similarity, but not necessarily identical. Okay, so let's look at some of these in a little bit more detail. And here, colleagues, I just need to say that obviously we could spend an entire day going through each of these sections. So what I'm going to be doing now is really a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through all of these different sections, and then we will move over to some questions and answers, and I will try to give you answers. If I can't give you answers, perhaps point you in a particular direction where you might find some answers. But okay, the title. So usually your title is provisional to your study, or maybe usually is too strong a word, but often your title will change. But it can be very helpful right from the start to include a title. Make sure your title is concise. You obviously have a title page, which will have information about who's working with you on this study, and so on and so forth. And ideally, the title should be clearly linked to your research question or your hypothesis. So these things should already start creating the golden thread that you are eventually going to see throughout your proposal. And remember, colleagues, and maybe this is going a little bit further down the line, when you eventually come to writing your research for publication, these are the sorts of things that will really help you. If you've thought at this phase of your research project carefully about the alignment of your title, your thinking, your research questions, and so on, that will stand you in good stead when you come to write your actual paper on the outcome of your study. So it's good to spend a bit of time thinking around these things. But probably more importantly, we move to the background or the introduction. And I think it was Lemise who was saying earlier that your proposal is the place where you show how your research is unique and how it can contribute to the body of knowledge. And right from the background, right from the introduction, you want to make a case for your research that is compelling. And here, perhaps less important for the ethics submission, but a lot more important for your supervisors and for the people who will later read your research. So at this stage, you want to provide an overview of, and I perhaps could have put in brackets there, of your envisaged research story. So make that case that is compelling. And a useful framework or heuristic that you can use that I've shared with you there comes from the work of someone called Lorelei Lingard, and she talks about the problem, the gap, and the hook, and how these should always be present in the background or introduction of your research proposal, and indeed of your research itself. So what is the issue? Remember, we don't only research problems. I know we talk about a problem statement, but we're not talking about problem there as in terms of something is wrong. What is the issue? What is the issue at hand that will be the focus of your study? And then the gap, why? What is it that is not known about this particular issue? And then the hook, why is this important? Why is this important to me, to the reader? Why will the reader get a sense that this is important? And as, of course, at ethics, they will ask the question, why is this research necessary? Why is it important? Why is it relevant? Which you would typically put in under your rationale. So these are all questions that need to be unpacked in your research proposal. Usually in your introduction or background, you hint at these things. And as you move forward in your research proposal, you provide more information. It's a little bit like imagining that you are a defense lawyer in court, and you want to convince the judge and the jury, although in South Africa we don't have jury, but you get the idea. You want to convince the judge that your client is innocent. What sort of information will you bring to bear? How are you going to convince them? So think in that way. Think about how you can argue and sell your research study. You would place the seeds of that in your background and your introduction. And then, of course, you get hold of the literature. And most of the questions right at the start related to the literature. Because you might have hinted at a whole lot of things in your background, but you are going to use the literature to nail it down, to make sure that the judge and jury can have no other, make no other decision other than not guilty once they've read your literature review, because you've provided the necessary background and the necessary argument. So in your literature, you need to be sure that your knowledge of the field is up to date. So watch out for that. Usually this is not a problem with the proposal because this is where you're at in your study, but it's also about providing a context for your knowledge gap. So again, remember problem, gap, hook. So what is the issue? What is the problem? You will do that demonstrating your knowledge, but then where is the gap? And then offer an evidence-based argument for why your study is necessary. Be careful of running too much with passion, what I call passion projects. Very often honors and master students will come and say, as you know, I work mostly in terms of teaching and learning. So people will come and say, I know the students don't use the feedback. So I want to do research on why students don't use feedback, why they don't respond to the feedback that's given to them on their work. But then we have to first say, hang on a minute, let's take a step back. You need to go to the evidence now to build that argument. Yes, it might be true that your students are not making use of the feedback that you are giving them, but you need to work with that a little bit and bring some evidence to bear. You can't just say, I have seen that my students are not making use of the feedback. That's not going to be strong enough in your proposal. Important that you cover the most important studies. And often that links up to people asking the question about scope and how much. I wish I had a clear-cut argument for you or a clear-cut answer for you there. But the issue, the bottom line is that you need to read. You need to read your way into the field, and you are going to initially read more than you need to because you're going to read down the wrong path initially. And that, unfortunately, is part and parcel of doing research. If there was a sort of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 recipe for doing the literature review, getting the sort of literature that you need to support your knowledge gap, to provide your rationale, then we would all be brilliant researchers. But it doesn't work that way. It's going to take time. It's going to take being very critical in your own reading, asking questions about your reading, and of course, drawing on the assistance that can be provided to you by your supervisors if you are a postgraduate student, or your research team. Get your colleagues on board, go to conferences, attend webinars like this. Be alert to what's happening in the field. Join international online conversations. There's so much available to keep us on board. At the end of the day, the only answer I can give you in terms of how much or the scope is that if someone else reads your literature review and give it to a colleague, and when they finished reading, they are convinced that this study that you are planning is relevant, is necessary, and will contribute to the knowledge, to the body of knowledge in the field, then you have provided a sufficient, you've covered sufficient because you have convinced them. So it's a bit of to and fro, backwards and forwards. Watch out for just plonking everything into the literature review in your proposal. That just gets ethics committees really irritated, and is a whole lot of unnecessary work. Keep that. It's not lost work. Keep it for the actual research itself. But for your proposal, you just want to give enough to convince them that the project is necessary and that it is going to respond to a gap. And obviously, it should lead directly to your research question and the purpose of your study. So there must be a very clear link. We often talk about a golden thread running through. I like the idea of the red line. The red line is an idea that was given to me by a very wise professor from the London School of Tropical Medicine many years ago. He said he told his students that when they finished writing, they must take a red pen or a thick red Koki and draw a line right down the middle of the page. And that red line represents the research question. And then they have to go and look at everything that is written on the page. And if anything that is on that page does not relate to the red line, does not relate to the research question, then it shouldn't be there. So there's perhaps a rule of thumb that you can play around with. Just another visual help for the issues of scope and rationale, and maybe getting a clear focus. You can see here many people talk about the funnel effect. Usually in your background and maybe also at the start of your literature review, you want to look quite broadly, and that's where I was saying you might end up having to read more than you will need. So more to do with your topic area than your research question specifically at the start. So you're trying to get a sense of the field. But as you go along, you're going to start narrowing, you're going to start looking at work that is really very closer to your topic, and narrower categories. So you may deal with sources in more detail. So initially you might only be reading abstracts, but now you're starting to read in a little bit more detail. But eventually, when you get to the literature that is specifically relevant to your work, specifically relevant to your research question, then you will be looking at certain key papers in more detail. And there's just an example of a reference there, library guides at Hull University in the United Kingdom. Of course, our own library has wonderful, wonderful guides. There's a lot of information available out there. Maybe just to pick up now quickly on the question, I think it was Zola had. What I was saying is that when you report the literature, because you're writing about what people are currently saying in the field about a particular issue, then you usually write in the present tense. If you are writing about something that happened at the end of the 19th century, then you would probably write in the past tense. But typically when we're dealing with the literature, we're dealing with the current conversation about a particular topic. Just one approach that I'm giving you on how to write a literature review. There are many, but you typically will cite what's in the field, compare what people are saying in the field at the moment, contrast what people are saying in the field, critique what is being said in the field, and then make connections. And those connections will very often speak to your conceptual framework, if that is a requirement in your field, in your area. Of course, your research question or your hypothesis, aims, objectives, these are what I would call the nuts and bolts of your study. And there needs to be careful alignment between these and, of course, then across the study. So remember what we've been doing now. We've started with an issue. We've said there's a gap. We've said that this study has the potential to respond to this gap in a very particular way. Then we've gone out again and we've looked at the literature and we've said, looking at the literature helps me emphasize why this is an issue, why there's a gap, and why it's important. And now we are saying, therefore, I want to ask this question. Therefore, I am proposing this hypothesis. Therefore, I aim to do A, B, and C. You get the sense of pulling these things through, because then you have to go to your methods or your methodology, depending on whether you're working quantitatively or qualitatively. And if those earlier aspects are not clear and are not in place, then very often you can get tripped up here. Undergraduates, postgraduate students very often will come to me and say, Susan, I want to conduct interviews with lecturers about AI. And then I say, okay, but let's go and start at the beginning, because where you're starting now is you're starting in the middle. But once you've got all of those things in place, then it becomes a lot easier to describe, look at your design, what type of study are you hoping to conduct? You need to be very specific here. This is a key part of the proposal. If you're working very often in qualitative domain, you need to describe the paradigm within which you're working. You need to describe your setting. Where will the study be undertaken? And what does that context look like? So you can't simply say will be undertaken at schools in the Western Cape. What is the context of those schools? How many schools are there? Where are they situated? Etc., etc. When you look at your population, sample, Your broader population, if you're looking at schools in the Western Cape, is your population grade 7 learners at primary schools? That's a huge population. How will you sample it? What approach will you use, and how will you recruit? So all of these where questions, and then who, why, and how. And we can spend days talking about this section of the proposal, but if you keep these four questions in mind, you will be well on your way. Where, who, why, and how. Stick with those. And so you can see here that these questions run through as you collect your data. You want to ask questions about what, how, why, and when. What data do you want to collect? How are you planning to collect it? Why do you want to collect that data? When will you collect that data? And I could have added where in this case again as well. And consistently looking for that alignment and justification throughout. Be specific in your writing, in your proposal. Rather be over-specific. So when you talk about data, think about how will this data answer your specific research question? Why are these people, or why is this source the right source for you to answer your research question? Tell your reader what thinking is going on in your head. Then you are far less likely to get comeback and questions. All right, and I've just got a few more sections to cover, and then I want us to open up because I really would like us to have good time until 11:30 when we have to close for questions. But very, very important, I mentioned this earlier, data management and data quality. Here I just want to emphasize, check the latest guidelines. Colleagues, this is definitely a moving target for those of us who do a lot of research. The new laws and new guidelines coming up on a regular basis as various things change or as people become more aware of loopholes. So the way in which you manage your data has become a really, really big issue in research, and you need to be very clear about this in your study. The good thing is that this is a bit of a recipe again. You can go and speak to more experienced researchers in your environment. Your supervisors will be able to help you so that you are sure that you've covered all the bits and pieces. Again, if you're preparing for research ethics submission, the various faculty guidelines are so detailed. The library provides us with a lot of details. This shouldn't be an area where you trip up, and yet it is very often the area where most students get their work back from ethics with a long list of modifications being requested. Create an audit trail, colleagues. And I know this seems like an unnecessary extra task, but especially those of you who perhaps doing PhDs, even those of you doing masters, studies that happen over a period of time. I know you believe you will remember everything you did, but trust me, you won't. It is what it is. Keep an audit trail of everything you do with your research right from the start. It will stand you in good stead and will often help to strengthen this section. When I get a new PhD student, the day we sort of sign the MOU and agree that we are going forward as a research team, I give them a journal, a hard copy journal. And I know that's quite old-fashioned now. Many people don't work with written journals anymore. But I give them a journal because it's my way of saying to them, please journal, please keep an audit of your PhD journey. And then so important to consult as needed. If you are going to be doing anything statistically related, consult the biostatistician as early as possible in the process. Sometimes people leave it quite late and end up having to go back quite far, even as far as revising their research question because of the input that they've received from the biostatistician. So very important to consult early on. We have wonderful librarians across the institution. Make friends with your librarian, with your subject librarian, and again, consult. They can provide you with a lot of guidance and a lot of advice as you work through your research proposal. And then ethical matters, I've sort of been hinting about at ethical matters throughout my conversation this morning. Where in the proposal are there ethically related issues? Well, the bottom line is that it's actually a lot more than you imagine, because of course, the ethics committees look at whether your study will do no harm, whether you've considered your participants in care, whether you're looking with care, whether you're looking after your data carefully, whether you're ensuring that everything is voluntary, that you've been very clear in your communication with your potential participants, that your informed consent form has been filled in correctly, that you provided enough information, that it's written in a way that your participants will understand it. But they also look at the way in which you've determined your sample and how you're going to recruit people for your study. Very important. And then they also have a responsibility to ensure that the work is feasible, and that's not something we've spoken about yet. And perhaps an omission on my side, I should have mentioned it earlier, but work that is not feasible, setting out on a study that is doomed to failure from the start because it requires equipment of several millions of dollars that you're not going to have, those sorts of things. Of course, it's also not ethical to do that sort of work. So the research committees will look broader and beyond what some of us might think are the obvious ethical issues. So they look at whether the work is important, and you need to convince them of that. That's what your proposal needs to be done, needs to do. And at the end of the day, they will ask, not only is this work ethically sound, but also is it important? Then just sort of the end matters, the last bits and pieces, the significance of your study. We mentioned that will obviously be linked to the rationale, but pushed forward a little bit in terms of how will this contribute to the body of knowledge in the field? How are you going to disseminate your work? Where are you going to take it? What are your plans for it? What sort of budget are you looking at? Really important to not have a vague budget. Just don't plonk numbers there, but show that you've thought about this. If you're going to have 60 participants, why are you going to need 6,000 Rand? Well, 60 times, and I'm going to get myself into trouble, but you get the idea. Show that in your budget, show that detail. And then timelines, well, timelines are what they are, especially in postgraduate studies, but for research generally. But nevertheless, have a clear timeline and a clear sense that shows that you are not only being critical in terms of what is possible, but also realistic in terms of what is possible. And then neatly attaching your appendices and having a flawless set of references. Really, really important. Maybe just to also say on the timeline, especially for those of you who are perhaps PIs on studies or postgraduate students, it's very useful to to create a Gantt chart as opposed to a linear timeline. If you're not sure what a Gantt chart is, G-A-N-T-T, go and have a look. It's a very useful tool. So just noticing your final protocol is unlikely, or your final proposal is unlikely to be anything like your initial ideas. Remember, I said that it's going to take you on this journey in terms of your thinking. It's not only about implementation. It will take time and hard work to develop. You won't get this written over the weekend. It is only ever a guide or a blueprint. It is likely to change. And at the end of the day, once it's been through all the ratification process, it's the university's indication to the university that the research is doable, feasible, I mentioned that, it's valid, it's necessary, and it's ethical. And I'm going to stop there because we have just under 15 minutes now for questions. So yes, I look forward to seeing your questions. You can raise your hands or you can put questions in the chat. And I see here that someone has popped in the link. If you don't know who your faculty librarian is, look for your subject area guide in the library guide. So thanks. I don't know who popped that in, but that's very helpful. Where do you need to go for ethical clearance if your research participants are not all from the same organization? So not entirely sure whether I've got the right idea about that question, but you will always need to go to your to the research committee that is responsible for research being conducted in your faculty, and they would give you guidance in terms of research participants if there are any anomalies there. But usually, if you are doing research under the auspices of the university, you go to your relevant research ethics committee, depending on the type of research that you're doing. Okay, let's see. Thank you, Teresa. Thanks for the kind words. How do I connect with a biostatistician? Marcus, I'm not sure which faculty you're in. I know in our faculty, we have a division of biostatistics within our Department of Global Health, so that makes it a little easier for us. But I do know that there are biostatisticians at the university. It might be a good idea to go and have a look at the postgraduate students' web page. There'd probably be some information there for you. Perhaps one of our librarian colleagues can also help. Otherwise, Martin, if you, oh, sorry, it's Marcus, I beg your pardon. Marcus, if you want to pop me an email, I'm sure I can find out. I just don't know offhand where one gets hold of a bias. Oh, there we go. Kirchner has answered the question. There's Centre for Statistical Consultation. So that's great. Colleagues, I need to say that we are incredibly privileged at Stellenbosch University in terms of the resources that we have and the support that we have for research. So please use those resources. People are waiting to support and assist you. Yeah. Yes, other questions, other comments? I ran through that so really quickly, and please don't be shy. I'd love to see your comments, your thoughts. Maybe you can tell me whether this spoke to your present context or whether you feel that you didn't really get anything for your particular situation at this point. I think that's also important for feedback. I do see the colleagues from the library have asked you to complete a feedback form. But I'd love to receive your questions. Yes.
Yes, Prof. I think we can try and tackle those questions at the beginning that we parked earlier.
Shall I?
The first question was from Kirna. I often get the question that is asked, what is the scope of the literature review should be for the proposal? That was the first one.
Okay, Songisa, I think I hope I addressed that partially when I was talking about the literature review. I was trying to just say that you know, it's difficult to say up front how long the literature review has to be. The literature review has to be sufficient to convince the reader that there is a need for this particular research on the one hand, and to provide sufficient evidence for the way in which the study is being designed and the rationale and so on and so forth. So it's a bit like saying, how much salt do I put into a pot of soup? You have to taste it. You have to keep on trying and checking. So it's one of those things that there's no clear-cut answer. Kirchner, I hope that helps you.
Yeah, in my experience also, I think the more you read, the more you realize, do I need to read more, or have I found enough now? The literature itself will usually be an indicator of how much I still need to verify something or not.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. So also what I have noticed is that different faculties have different expectations in terms of the length of the proposal. And that might also give you a bit of guidance in terms of how many pages. In my field, where most of my students are working in a qualitative space, so they'll be working in interpretivist paradigm or realist paradigms, or, you know, then their literature reviews tend to be slightly longer because they need to develop that argument. But their supervisors and more experienced researchers can offer guidance. Marika, you're asking just for planning, what is the average time to complete a proposal? Sure. I think that it depends a lot on how clear your research question is. If your research question is clear, in other words, you know exactly what you want to do, and you have read enough to have a research question that can stand up to scrutiny, then my sense would be that a couple of weeks would be sufficient to complete a proposal. But if you are entering and you've got this vague idea that I want to study why geraniums grow in the summer, then I think it's going to take longer, typically. But I know of people who've managed to pull a rabbit out of a hat in quite a short space of time. So I think it depends on how driven you are, how much you know, your context, and how clear a sense you have for your research question. Thanks, Michelle. I'm glad that you found it helpful.
Yes, Prof. The other one was from Mkhwashu Sibongiseni. It reads as follows. How do you effectively synthesize existing literature to support the rationale for your research?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I remember seeing it now. We didn't talk about that. So let's use a few minutes to talk about the idea of synthesis. So one of our challenges is, especially when we're starting out with our proposals and indeed with our research generally, is that we don't know enough about the field. We haven't read the body of literature yet to be able to critically engage with what we're reading right now. So we have to read a couple of articles, and very often what people will do is they'll maybe highlight. I suppose online nobody highlights with paper and highlighters anymore, but they highlight the key ideas, and then they start writing, and then they say so-and-so said this, and so-and-so said that, and so-and-so said the next thing. So they sort of try and really give an overview of the literature. When you start looking at synthesis. The best way to approach synthesis is to read a number of articles and then take a step back and say, what is the idea that is coming out in all of these articles, or in most of the articles? And then the literature review changes slightly, because then you're able to say, dominant thinking in the field at this time relates to the scent of a geranium that grows in the fields of the Northern Cape. And then you reference all the different studies that spoke to the scent of the geranium in the fields of the Western Cape, in the Northern Cape. So in other words, what you do is you start synthesizing the ideas in the literature, as opposed to saying that Van Schalkwyk et al. Said this, and Russ et al. Said that, and Monkolo et al. Said this. Now, instead of doing that, you're saying some of the key ideas are this and that and that. And if you approach the literature in that way, it starts giving you a greater chance to ensure that you synthesize. So I don't know if that helps. I don't know who set that question right at the start. When, what I've told you now, I usually take about an hour to work through. We work through processes of literature reviews, but I see that Kirchner is saying that there is a webinar this afternoon, I think, on how to practically approach literature reviews, and they're going to be practical exercises on how to synthesize. So there you go. Let me not say any more. Let me leave it over to the experts who will be picking up on that this afternoon. So I think, Songiza, that perhaps I can hand over to you at this point. And to those who are sending through your thanks, it was a great pleasure. It's always wonderful to be part of Library Week. I did my PhD in the days when we didn't have access to the internet the way we have access now. And the librarians that I worked with were my lifesavers. They were my angels, and they kept me going. And so it's always a pleasure to work with the library in this special week. So good luck to all of you with your research. You're all at the start, presumably, if you're working on your proposals, but I wish you well. I wish you much success. And yeah, drop me a line when you publish on your studies.
Oh, thank you so much, Prof. This was so fruitful, and I'm pretty sure everyone is clear and more often understanding exactly how now to do the things to make the wells to flow. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the link. Yes, the link was shared by Kirchner and myself. It was for the feedback for this specifically session. So please do indulge in that link. And thank you so much, colleagues, and everyone that has attended this session. Really fruitful and really meaningful to attend this session. Thank you so much. The next session now will be starting at past on the link that I think the link that Kirchner shared, or the other one on EndNote, and the afternoon one will be the literature review. Thank you so much, Prof. We really appreciate it. Thanks, colleagues.